Hi everyone, this is Studio Slave, and in this video we're going to make a low rumbling techno bass using a convolution reverb technique. So this is the project I've got so far, and I've just removed the bass. So that is just the syncopate template, which is available for download on the website, but I've taken the bass out of it because we're going to create that and put it back in now. And we're going to do that by placing a convolution reverb on this kick channel. We're then going to manipulate that slightly, and we're going to then resample that to audio. We're then going to place that resampled audio into a simpler device on a MIDI track, and then we can start to add in the effects and devices to manipulate that sound and make it into a dark, rumbling techno bass. So you can see I've got this audio track here underneath the kick group, and this is what we're going to use to resample the kick onto once we've placed the convolution reverb on the kick. And by doing it like that, it gives us a lot more control over the actual resampled audio, as opposed to not resampling it and have to constantly send a signal from this kick into a convolution reverb, which uses up a lot of CPU. And then it becomes very hard to manipulate the sound because we've got to solo it, and then we always need to make sure that the kick is also being sent to that sound. So in general, it's always better to resample where you can. So now what we need to do is just place the convolution reverb onto the kick, and I tend to find this works much better than a traditional or stock reverb, just because it's a much nicer sound coming from the convolution. So all we're going to do here is, once we've put the convolution on, is we want to place on a EQ8 as well. And what we're going to be doing with these two devices is essentially shaping how this kick or how this convolution reverb is going to sound. So we want it to be nice, low and rumbly, so we can pull the filters right down. And at this point, all we're really trying to do is mess around with the convolution reverb's settings and presets, and also the EQ8, so we can change the filters and the different filter slopes and whereabouts we're sitting along the frequency spectrum to try and create a bunch of different sounds. And then from there we can decide which type of reverb we like the sound of most, and then we can resample this, and then we can work on it further. So this is just to get us in a rough area of where we want to go and how we want the reverb to sound. So there is a little bit of method to how we fiddle with the convolution reverb and the EQ to get a good sound out of this. So I tend to find these bigger sounds, such as these real spaces that we have here, do work quite well because they rumble on for quite a long time, and you can see you get the time indicator in the panel of the convolution reverb. So sometimes you can use a tighter reverb, but in general I find these work quite well. So some of the settings that we're going to want to go through is, firstly, we need to have this set to fully wet. And this just makes sure that we've got none of the original dry signal coming through from the kick. And then what we can do is we can manipulate the sound further using the decay and the size and the pre-delay. The pre-delay just pushes this away from the original kick sound, and we're not going to really notice this at the moment because our kick is set fully wet with this reverb on. But essentially, with the size control, is we can either pull this to the left, and this is going to give us a more metallic and a more colourful reverb. And if we go the other way, we're going to have a less coloured reverb. And then if we pull the decay tighter, then obviously this is going to shorten our reverb. And if we go the opposite way, it's going to be longer and more dense and more rumbly. So sometimes you want it to rumble on longer, other times you don't. And likewise, sometimes you want a coloured one and sometimes you want a less coloured one. And then what we can also do is we can accentuate that with either a pre or a post EQ, and we can just accentuate a single band and push that into the convolution reverb or accentuate it afterwards. So now I'm just going to adjust these settings on the fly so you can see what I mean. And I'll try not to talk too much. So here we have a tight reverb, and I'll boost up the size so it's smaller, so we have a more colourful sound. You can hear there's much more going on in the higher frequencies there. You can hear it's a much smoother sound as we go into the higher size range. Sounding pretty good. Remember, this is only a ballpark area. We can adjust this later on, and we can add some extra effects to bolster the level. Also, don't forget you've also got some extra menus here for things such as the damping and the EQ. What we can also do is we can add a bit more tone using a EQ band, and we can use the Alt shortcut to adjust the Q. And then we could set this, we could even make this resonate at a certain frequency or pitch. So in this case we're at around F at about 45 Hertz. We could go up to about 49, which would be a G. And if we wanted to, we could actually go an octave higher, up around the 100 Hertz area as well, and get the second harmonics to poke through. But in this case, we'll leave this as it is. I'm just going to group these instruments or these devices together. And what we can now do is we can then record this onto this audio track, and we can either do this via the resampling, or what we could also do is we could just take the input of this audio track and set it to the kick. So it's now going to take the signal directly from the output of our kick track, and then once we've recorded or resampled this, we can then turn those devices off that are on our kick. So make sure we arm the audio track and then hit record. Okay, so I know that a lot of people won't want to resample, but trust me, it does pay to be able to edit the actual audio instead of doing it on stuff that's getting processed in real time. So now we can turn this stuff off, which was on the kick track. I'm just going to move this into the group, and we can switch off these devices because we just want our standard kick now. And I'm just going to collapse these down and keep them there in case we might want to revisit them or look at the settings that we used at a later stage. And we can now hear we have just our reverb on its own. So now that we have our resampled reverb bass, let's just rename this track and color code it so we don't get confused. And it's important here that we don't want to catch the very first part of this, or you can see where it's overlapped when we've resampled it, because we might have a little click or a pop here. And as well as that, another problem we might have is that when the reverb first sounds or is first initialized, it might take a while for the density to build up because it's a long reverb of maybe 3 or 4 seconds. So you don't necessarily want to grab the last part. So what you want to do is make sure that you consolidate it, and then what we can do is we can drag this down into our MIDI channel and create a simpler device. And as you can see there, I've not quite consolidated this properly, so I've just got to go back onto this, press Command and J, and consolidate that. And this is also going to crop it, so this is its own singular referenced file. And then we can drag this back in. So let's pull this down into the simpler device, and then let's just clean the project up a little bit. So we now don't need this resampled reverb bass anymore, so I'm going to get rid of that. And then we can also rename our new MIDI track to the reverb bass, and then we can also create a MIDI clip as well, and we can lay out a MIDI note which is going to be C3, and what that's going to do is it's then going to play the audio that we recorded exactly as it was. Depending on your default presets, you might need to change a few settings on your simpler. So for me, I need to push up my sustain all the way up. This means I'm going to get a nice sustain note instead of just a 600 millisecond click. I'm also going to put warp mode on and set that to complex, and that just means that the pitch or the tempo isn't going to change as I hit the different notes, so it's going to stay the same, and I'm not going to get my loop playing back faster or slower. And I'm also going to set my voices to 1, so if I do decide to play different notes on the keyboard, then I can do that, and they're not going to start playing loads of different samples for a long time at once. So just to test this, we can now play that up and down the keyboard and the notes aren't overlapping. I'm just playing this sustained note and we can hear this is sounding pretty good on its own, but there's a few things we can notice about this. For a start, it's a bit quiet, and also it's still in stereo. So what we can do is we can bolster the level slightly and listen to it in context with the kick drum. So before we start to add the rest of the effects, let's start with the first protocol, which is the volume. So I'm actually going to just turn this up using the simpler device because mine defaults to -12 decibels. So I'm just going to whack this up to maybe -6 or -3, and then we can listen again and make some decisions as to where we want to go next or what we need to change. Okay, so before we tackle the stereo problem, let's first get a little bit of movement and a bit more sound shaping into this. So we could do this using something like the frequency shifter and create a little harmonic cell, but in this case what I'm going to do is just use the auto filter, and all I want to do is just reduce some of the frequencies as the reverb tails on slightly. So this is also something that could be done with the damping feature of the convolution reverb. This also gives us a second stage of sculpting the sound as well. So here I'm going to set the frequency to 110 Hz, and we could also add the resonance as well. And then we can either add the movement using the envelope here on the left, or we could do it using the amount value on the right. And this is going to allow us to essentially modulate the sound. So because this is techno, we know that this is going to be a 4x4 beat, so we can set the rate to a quarter note, which is every kick drum, and this is going to set the frequency to either move up or down for each beat. So we can select a shape that we want, so I'm going to go for the ramp down, and then all we have to do is push the LFO amount up, and this is going to set by how much we want the filter frequency cutoff point to either move up or down by. So essentially it's now doing this, and obviously we could choose a different shape, but in this case all I'm going to do is I'm going to dial back this amount to something more sensible. So this will give us a slightly more rumbled sound instead of being slightly higher up in the frequency spectrum for the entire tail of the reverb. Okay, so now we have our auto filter, which is acting as our second stage of sound shaping, and it's also allowing us to add a little bit of motion either using the envelope section or the LFO section. So now what we're going to do is beef the signal up using overdrive and saturation. I'll just turn the saturator off for now, and we can use the overdrive to basically overdrive the top of the signal if we push the dynamics up, or if we pull the dynamics down, then it's just going to affect the whole signal uniformly, which is what we want for this sort of thing, otherwise we're going to get distortion. And then we can also push the dry wet all the way up as well, and this allows us to pinpoint where we want the overdrive using the filter in the top. So obviously we want this down in the lower end, so we could set this with a low Q factor and put it down to about 50 Hz. And we're also going to have this at a 50% dry wet as well, and we're going to pull the drive down because it's a bit too distorted for my ears at the moment. So this is fairly subtle, and we don't want it to be completely confined to the area of this filter, because obviously we have got a lot more going on than just 50 Hz at a 50 or a 0.5 Q here, so that's why I've set it to 50% dry wet. And then we're also going to use the saturator just to bolster the sound a little bit more and thicken it up. Okay, so now it's time to tackle the stereo problem. So we use a utility device, and if we upgrade this, there's a few different things we can do. We can change it from stereo to just the left or just the right. So just to show you how that sounds. Or just the right signal. So as you can tell, one is quite different from the other. If we set it back to stereo, what we can also do, if we change this from mid-side mode, we can switch this back so the whole thing is mono. Or what we could also do is just mono the bass now, and we can also audition that with the headphone button below, and we can set the frequency. So this is real handy because it means what we can do is we can keep our bass in mono, and we can actually keep the rest of the sound stereo. So we'll just push the width up here. Now everything below 180 Hz is in mono, and the rest of the reverb bass is right up into the sides of the mix. So this is really good if you want a high presence in the sides for whatever reason, or more width to your bass, and you're avoiding any of those problems with phasing frequencies in the low end. So what I actually like to do is I like to keep that at 120 Hz, and we've got the bass monoed. But what we're going to do is we're going to pull in the bass, so we still have it stereo above 120 Hz, but we only want it slightly stereo. So I'm just going to pull that in to about 50%, so it's not all over the place and just keeps it a lot more controlled. So just to recap, that's probably the most important tip in this tutorial, is to use a utility device and make sure you either choose the left channel or the right channel, or you collapse the stereo channels down to mono, or at least sort of sub 100 to 150 hertz in mono, just so you don't get phasing and the frequencies cancelling each other out and making your bass not as powerful or dense as it could possibly be. So that's going to stop you getting any phasing issues. Okay, so next up we need to think about space. So what we need to do is choose, is the kick going to be more powerful, or is the reverb bass going to be more powerful? And if they're going to be hitting at the same time, then one of these needs to give in, so we need to make room for the other one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sidechain the kick onto this bass. So this is going to mean that every time the kick hits, the bass is going to move out of the way of the kick. So we can do that just using a simple sidechain compressor. Pretty standard sidechain compressor settings. So I'm just going for a short attack, average release. I'm going to set the look ahead to 1 millisecond. So this means that it's going to be able to look ahead of the beat and start to pull down the bass slightly earlier to make sure it's ducked in time for the attack of the kick coming through. And then all I have to do is pull down this threshold until we're getting a suitable amount of ducking and it's not ruining the sort of shape of the reverb bass, and it's still got a decent groove. Let's do a quick before and after of all of these different effects. So I'm just going to group these together and then I'm going to play the track and the bass, and what I'm going to do is just mute and unmute this group so you can hear the difference it makes with a bit of processing and especially the stereo imaging. Okay, so you should be able to hear it's a lot more thicker there and a lot more dense, and it just sounds a lot better in the context of the track. So one last thing is, don't forget, if you need to, you can always go and add some macro controls here, save this as a device rack, and then every time you decide to do a resampled reverb bass, all you got to do is throw this on, and then you can manipulate things such as the overdrive, the saturation, pedal, cabinet, or amp, as they're really good things to manipulate throughout the track. And you can have everything set to these macro controls, so you only have to adjust them ever so slightly and you're going to get a whole different host of decent reverb basses which are going to be usable across all of your different techno tracks. Okay, so now I'm just going to pull this down by a few decibels and I'm going to let the track play out in context. And if you like the sound of this project, then you can get this from the Studio Slave website. And also don't forget to drop a comment below on any other techniques that you want us to cover to do with techno in the next video.